Our final lesson then on the first section of the Cold War course is the Hungarian uprising of 1956. So far we have looked at how the Cold War got deeper and deeper, colder and colder, as the Russians and Americans square up to each other because ideologically they cannot get along. That in turn leads to increased hostility and the development of more and more powerful weapons which can't be used but both deter each other from starting a war. What we're going to look at today is the first of three attempts to overthrow communism, or at least change communism to make it a better system for the people that are living in it. Hungary in 1956 was a country in Eastern Europe occupied by the Soviet Union, and in doing so to prevent the West attacking Russia again. Of course, the Hungarian people didn't get asked if they wanted to be occupied by the Russians, nor did they get asked if they wanted to be living under a communist dictatorship. In 1956, the Hungarians take things into their own hands, and we will see this again in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, and ultimately in the mid-1980s when the Russians try to reform communism themselves. So the first thing you need to do is to unscramble these words. I will play through all of the words, and then you can pause at the end or pause as I go and unscramble the words. Remember, your job will be not just to unscramble them, but to understand what the word is and why the word is significant. Pause the video now. As we unscramble these words then, it's important upon you as the learner to make sure you have the words that you either can't unscramble or the words that you can't explain. You need to have them written down, and you need to make sure that you take an independent role in finding out what these words mean and why they're significant. Number one then is superpower. This is the name given to Russia and America during the period of the Cold War from 1945 to 1991. These were the two countries that led their respective ideological systems, the Americans the capitalist democratic world and the Russians the communist dictatorship world. Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union through until his death in 1953. Today we're going to look at the world after Stalin's death. The Cold War, the name given to the period between 1945 and 1991, where America and Russia were effectively at war without actually using force against each other. Communism is the system of government used by Russia, a type of dictatorship. 5 is an uprising. Today we're going to look at the Hungarian uprising, when the people of Hungary fought back. 6 is the Iron Curtain, the name given to the border between East and West Europe, running right through the centre of Europe and cutting Germany in two. Winston Churchill coined the name the Iron Curtain in 1946. Berlin, the capital of Germany. Germany was partitioned in 1945 into 4 zones of occupation, and if you recall, Berlin was also partitioned into 4 zones of occupation: West Berlin and East Berlin, and it was the centre of the Berlin airlift and the Berlin blockade in 1948. Berlin is the centre of the Cold War. Capitalism is the economic system of the West. Yalta was the conference in 1945 where Europe was divided. And the Big Three is the name given to the leaders of Russia, America and the United Kingdom during the Second World War in their attempts to defeat Adolf Hitler. Next then, you need to be able to match these dates, these events to the correct dates. Please go through. Some of these you have been taught, some of these that you haven't been. Wider knowledge there. You need to be able to match some of these up. Pause the video now, please. Okay, slightly ahead of where we are now, but you may have come across this in wider viewing and wider reading you've underdone. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961. The Hungarian Revolution that we're studying today, 1956. Stalin's death is 1953. So there's going to be a connection between Stalin's death and the Hungarian uprising. The Korean War is not part of the syllabus, but that is a war that is effectively backed by both the Americans and the Russians, but they can't fight directly, so they fight through other countries. America supports South Korea and Russia supports North Korea, and that's from 1950. The Yalta Conference was 45, and Roosevelt's death was also 45. Khrushchev is our second leader of the Soviet Union, and he comes to power in 1953. Sputnik, from the work we've done on the space race, that is the Russian satellite that is launched into orbit around the world and over the United States, and that's in 1957. That came as a great shock to the Americans that the Russians were ahead. The Potsdam Conference was 1945, and that was the conference where Truman and Attlee replaced Roosevelt and Churchill. Stalin was also there. And finally, China becomes a communist nation in 1949. Who are these key individuals then associated with the Cold War? You should be able to name these. Please pause the video now. We have Stalin, his successor Khrushchev, President Kennedy of the United States, who will become president in 1960, so slightly ahead of the talk course that we've done so far. Churchill, the British Prime Minister during World War II. This is Chairman Mao, who will lead the communists to power in China in 1949 and scare the world because it clearly showed that containment of communism wasn't working. President Eisenhower of the United States, who succeeds President Truman. Attlee, the British Prime Minister, who succeeds Churchill. And President Leonid Brezhnev, who will overthrow Khrushchev in the 1960s. So today we're looking at the Hungarian uprising of 1956, and we need to learn about the causes and the consequences of the Hungarian uprising. Now, we're going to start with these 6 key points. Now, these are absolutely critical to your understanding of the course because these key points are truths that run through the entire course. And we will always remember these, and then we will apply this to our learning and understanding. Key point number 1. Capitalism, that is the economic system that the West used, always led to faster economic growth and wealth than communism did. Capitalism worked faster. The USA and its allies in Western Europe were always wealthier than those in Eastern Europe. 2. The higher levels of wealth in the West meant that the West could spend more money on weapons as well as increasing the wealth of its people at the same time. The West was able to do both. The communist world simply could not. They could build the weapons, but consequently the people suffered. Number 3. People in democratic countries tended to be happier and more content than those in dictatorships. We're looking at the Hungarian people rebelling today, not the people in France. People in dictatorships who didn't choose those dictatorships were not as happy as those people in the West. 4. Human nature led to people in Eastern Europe becoming jealous. They looked over the Iron Curtain, they heard what was going on over the Iron Curtain, and they were jealous of people in the West. This was made worse by the fact that communism placed a high value on education. People in Eastern Europe were educated very well. Far more of them went to university than in the West during the Cold War, and consequently you have jealous, very well educated people who know fully well that communism is not working, and they were not happy. Fifthly, communism simply could not reform itself. For communism to reform, the dictatorships would have to loosen control over the people. The problem is that when more freedom was given to the people, they wanted more. Therefore, communism could not reform. We're going to see that today in Hungary. We're also going to see that in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and in the Soviet Union itself in the 1980s. What happened in Hungary is when control was loosened, the Hungarians wanted to have more control over Hungary themselves rather than the Russians, and this is increasing nationalism. And then finally, those in power in communist countries were often the people for whom communism worked best. They had the best things, the best food, the greatest material wealth. Therefore, the people in power were the very ones least likely to want to change things. We'll highlight those key points. Remember those 6 points? It will underpin the entire course. Okay, so in 1953, Stalin, the leader of the communist world, dies. Here he is in his state funeral. The world held its breath. What would happen after the death of Stalin? At some time before 3 a.m. on March the 2nd, 1953, Stalin had a stroke. The guards were afraid to disturb him, and it was not until 24 hours after his colleagues had left him that they returned with doctors. Taking it in turns 2 at a time, they kept watch by his bedside for the 3.5 days it took Stalin to die. Although he occasionally regained consciousness, he was unable to speak. The death agony was terrible. Gods grant an easy death only to the just. He literally choked to death as we watched. At what seemed like the very last moment, he suddenly opened his eyes and cast a glance over everyone in the room. It was a terrible glance, insane, or perhaps angry and full of fear of death. Then something incomprehensible happened. To this day, I can't forget. He suddenly lifted his hand as though he were pointing to something above and bringing down a curse on us all. The gesture was incomprehensible and full of menace. The next moment, after a final effort, the spirit wrenched itself free of the flesh. That was a description of Stalin's death by his own daughter, Svetlana, who was there. So, what is this to do with the Hungarian uprising? Well, Stalin was dead. He dies in 1953. And immediately afterwards, the new leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, starts a process of de-Stalinization. He wants to undo what he calls the worst parts of Stalin's rule, what he calls his excesses. In Hungary, taking their lead from Nikita Khrushchev, the Hungarians removed their leader, Matthias Rákosi, a rather unpleasant dictator of their own country. The Hungarians were inspired by the death of Stalin and the emergence of Khrushchev. They believed that Khrushchev would be a nicer, more tolerant, less dictatorial leader. They believed that de-Stalinization had created the conditions for reform and change in Hungary. In 1956, the Polish people revolted against the Russians, and the Hungarians took their cue from them. There was even hope that the Soviets would leave Hungary altogether. The Hungarians elected a new leader to replace Rákosi, and he was Imre Nagy. He was appointed in October 1956. And throughout this period, he modernized Hungary. He was a reformer. But once he started reforming, the Hungarians wanted more and more freedom. You can see here, for example, the statue of Stalin here in Budapest is torn down. The power and the size of these protests caught the Soviet Union off guard. The Russian army retreated and left Hungary, chased out by the Hungarian people. However, the Soviet Union's withdrawal was not permanent but tactical. It allowed the Soviet Union's forces to regroup. Khrushchev waited to see what would happen in Hungary. But when Hungary threatened to leave the Warsaw Pact, when it threatened to leave the alliance of countries in Eastern Europe and possibly elect a democratic government, the Soviets returned and crushed the uprising. There was bitter fighting and over 30,000 Hungarians were killed. Imre Nagy hid inside the Yugoslav embassy, and he eventually came out because he was promised safe passage. The Soviets, however, arrested and executed him. They then reinstalled a new leader under the communist János Kadar, and he would rule Hungary as a communist dictatorship loyal to Russia until the 1980s. Your task today, then, is to understand what the causes and consequences of the Hungarian Revolution were, identify the key facts in the center. Now, you are directed to this information here, which are the statements that you can place into the correct boxes. To understand and the context and the meaning of these statements, you need to watch either the BBC History file on the Hungarian Revolution or the Cold War documentary After Stalin. The BBC file is the easier of the two. The Cold War documentary After Stalin is the more complex of the two. But watching both will make the statements here clearer and more easy to understand, and then complete that documentary. You can then work through the remaining part and recapping and exam analysis of the rest of the PowerPoint.